seems that there's a much more negative view of fascism than communism.
Go to Joe 30330 and help me.
The rats, the hyenas, start to eat each other.
And he is turning over the tables in the swamp.
We came out of the Mar-a-Lago summit with very high hopes. I worked for him, yes, I was a politically commissioned officer.
Get those white guys, get them, get them.
You know, spelling that out sounds somewhat invidious, and we don't really have time to clean up the mess. Am I inferior to John von Neumann? I don't think so, and I don't think you think so.
What is your opinion on Brazilian Prime Minister Bolsonaro regarding, there's a lot of things moving here, deforestation of the rainforest? P.S. I'm a Christian, I'd bake you a cake though. I don't know enough about him, but it sounds like he really hates Marxism and he's really pushing Brazil to become more of a world leader, and that he actually is for capitalism, and he's trying to get some of the SJW stuff out of the schools. I just saw a tweet by him a day or two ago. So on that front, and again, I don't know a ton about him, that all sounds good to me. And as a Christian, I appreciate your offer to bake me a cake.
On regulatory matters, and what the system actually did was to try to corral all of this ongoing information and to eventually filter it into a subcommittee of the Federal Reserve Board.
Dr. Greenspan, I'm going to interrupt you. The question I have for you is, you had an ideology, you had a belief that that free, competitive, and this is your statement, I do have an ideology. My judgment is that free, competitive markets are by far the unrivaled way to organize economies. We've tried regulation, none meaningfully worked. That was your quote. You had the authority to prevent irresponsible lending practices that led to the subprime mortgage crisis. You were advised to do so by many others, and now our whole economy is paying its price. You feel that your ideology push you to make decisions that you wish you had not made?
Well, remember that what an ideology is a conceptual framework with the way people deal with reality. Everyone has one. You have to exist, you need an ideology. The question is whether it is accurate or not. And what I'm saying to you is, yes, I found a flaw. I don't know how significant or permanent it is, but I've been very distressed by that fact. May I just finish an answer to the question previously?
You found a flaw in the reality?
A flaw in the model that I perceived is the critical functioning structure that defines how the world works, so to speak.
In other words, you found that your view of the world, your ideology, was not right. It was not working.
Precisely. No, that's precisely the reason I was shocked, because I've been going for 40 years or more with very considerable evidence that it was working exceptionally well. But just let me, if I may.
Well, but the problem is that the time is
Welcome to the Michael Brooks Show. I'm Michael Brooks. We're broadcasting live from downtown Brooklyn, USA, where left is best, as it is everywhere else, with super producer Matt Leck.
Hello.
Hello. Chief economist, Leonard Peltier advocate, and rare boots collector, David Griscom.
How's it going?
Good to be back with you guys on this week's program. Elaine Yu, she's a reporter For the AFP, we just did a primer and illicit history of the uprisings in Hong Kong, and they have heated up. We're talking about the tactics of the movement in Hong Kong, the different political players inside the movement, the role of China. Is there a role of the United States? What's happening on the ground there? Then, I don't know where Briahna Joy Gray has been, to be honest. She used to be on our show all the time, but apparently she's in some type of media operation somewhere.
Yeah,
or
got
something.
better things to do.
Is it? So what is like a PR shop?
Yeah, something like that.
Something like that.
A little
apparently.
outfit somewhere out in the
It was something
Midwest.
for like Jewish geriatrics or something. I don't know.
Some making the world a better place sort of thing.
Some type of world make. Yeah, well, that sounds Brie. She would be out making the world a better place. Anyways, she is crew on TMBS, crew emeritus, always crew in heart. She returns for a conversation on the Sanders campaign. What's actually going on as Bernie Sanders builds this movement for transformation across the country, and the media goes to war against him? And why is it so important that the Sanders campaign talk about the corporate ownership and monopolies inside media as a direct consequence of their cultural and economic bias against the Sanders campaign, man, policy, and movement? We got to get to that. Shout out indigenous peoples marching against the Bolsonaro's regime's cuts to healthcare, destruction of the Amazon, and new student uprisings in Brazil as more and more and more Lava Jato revelations hit. And a big win for the center-left in Argentina. Could it be, as Dilma Rousseff said, the beginning of seeing light at the end of the tunnel? For this past several years, reactionary U.S.-backed forces in Latin America. That could be possible. We certainly hope so. We'll get to that. And the post-game, we're going to all tell you what we think of this Jeffrey Epstein thing. Because I think we might need to throw the conspiracy theorists the keys to this one. At least the smart conspiracy theorists. Update on Kashmir. Reference the conversation we have with Murtaza Hussain on it. We'll get back to the Indian repression and the very real danger of conflict with Kashmir. What actually de-radicalizes people? Talking about Scott Atran, even as Brexit threatens the extraordinary accomplishments of the Northern Ireland Good Friday Accords, all of that and much, much more on the post-game. It's my birthday, so become a patron. Thanks, everybody. But first, let's talk about ideology. It's probably not going to surprise anybody watching or listening to this that if somebody says, or most people, if somebody asserts that they are non-ideological or post-ideological, you're usually talking to the most ideological people on earth. We're not talking about building buildings or the best way to serve a tennis ball or some other technical function. When you're talking about politics, when you're talking about economics, when you're talking about broad social forces, and you say, I look at it non-ideologically, you are deeply and profoundly in ideology, almost 100% necessarily. And almost certainly that ideology is some form of neoliberal centrism. People on the right tend to have very little problem identifying themselves somewhere on an ideological map. The left, as it has reemerged, you're seeing more people quite willing to say, no, I stand somewhere, and I stand somewhere for specific reasons, whether or not I'm talking about myself as an actual progressive or as a socialist, and so on. Pete Buttigieg and Kamala Harris exemplify an idea of what now is called, and particularly called in Democratic primaries, of pragmatic progressives. And they claim to not be governed by ideology, but in fact by what is possible. Kamala Harris had a profile written of her in the New York Times several weeks ago, which seemed essentially almost directly laundered from Harris campaign talking points, that talked about how her focus was not on macro interventions or really any structural change, but in engineering the power and the bureaucracy of the federal government to help those most in need. And that may or may not be true in certain cases. We can take those policy debates on their own terms. Clearly, from her criminal justice record, there's very important areas where that is absolutely not true. There's other areas where it may be true in a minimal sense. But the problem is that the crises that she wants to deal with in a limited way are, of course, the fundamental byproduct of the system that she so steadfastly refuses to challenge. A denial of ideology in its purest form, because you believe your worldview is not created by political and philosophical conclusions, but by a quote-unquote objective reality. I've talked with Daniel Bessner about the incredible danger of those block terms in politics, terms like national security, the economy, these large macro terms that actually mean very little in real practice and have vastly different meanings, implications, and experiences for different people depending on where they are. It's very profitable to be a post-ideological politician because you can gesture to problems in our society. Lack of health care, inequality, even student debt, without having to focus on the system that creates these very same problems. It's not surprising. And of course, Buttigieg just oozes this. This is why someone who on paper is a ridiculous candidate for president, a mayor of a college town in his mid-30s, would, in the best of circumstances, should be asked to maybe do a few more things. But we actually know that primarily what he's known for is some extremely disturbing things on race policing and gentrification. But because he is a McKinsey guy and a Rhodes Scholar, and because he speaks in this non-ideological way, he's able to sort of massage the erogenous zones of the media. It's not surprising that Buttigieg and Harris are the lead with billionaire donors over Sanders and Warren. Most progressives are able to recognize this, but struggle to understand why we argue that it's really important that Bernie Sanders is in fact a socialist and is in fact leading a movement when compared to Elizabeth Warren and some of her very, very good ideas. It matters that Bernie's a socialist and that Warren wants well-regulated capitalism because you can see the distinction in their messaging and, in fact, the fundamental difference in their plans. See, Bernie does have a plan, and the plan is actually already here. This is another fundamental advantage of the Sanders campaign and another reason why he is a structural threat and Warren is not. See, Warren has started to adopt the Sanders argument. Well, the way we're going to do bold things to reform the economy is we'll have a social movement. Well, Bernie's social movement is here now because that is the structure of the campaign. That's the warning messages on ICE raids. That's the immediate solidarity with the attacks on abortion rights. A caller recently noted to me, even with Tiffany Caban, who heartbreakingly came up short in her district attorney's race, that yes, Warren and Sanders both endorsed her, but Sanders' campaign was sending text messages, directing people to help on the recount, treating it like not just an endorsement, but part of a national organizing effort. Bernie's political revolution, not me, us, versus she's got a plan. Can you hear the fundamental distinction here and the fundamental problem with, yes, in some respects, although I will always say, look, you cannot vote in a fully humane and progressive way if you ignore foreign policy. Elizabeth Warren, unfortunately, has both a very bad record on foreign policy in key areas and has not moved significantly on it. Sanders, in some areas, has a very good foreign policy. In other areas where he has been weak, he has actually moved and begun to articulate something different. So that always needs to be noted. But Bernie's rhetoric goes beyond the moral. People should have health care. To the political, people should be able to have control over their life. And having health care should not be governed by your employer or your wealth. It goes beyond fixing a broken system. It actually begins the fuller steps towards seriously democratizing our society. Same thing with student debt. Universal forgiveness versus conditional forgiveness. That's Warren's plan. It's better. It's not Kamala Harris's work in as well. I mean, in fact, Kamala Harris's plan, I won't even go for the cheap joke. I don't see how Kamala Harris's conditionality of student debt on starting businesses in underserved communities doesn't turn into another major accelerator, as if there aren't enough, of gentrification, at least in places like New York and San Francisco and many others. But why the limit? Why the means test? Why the unnecessary technocracy? Why the division in something that actually should be just a universal liberation for all that will pay enormous democratic and economic benefits? When Bernie talks about the billionaire class and names particular individuals, he's working to build class consciousness out of an economic system that creates losers to create winners. This is far different from Warren's rhetoric of a rigged game. Both want to change the system, but Bernie and his movement, they want to transcend it and reset it, and they don't have a romanticism about what existed before. You know, it would be cheap and ridiculous to compare either Sanders or Warren to Trump. A lot of people try to make that cheap, stupid comparison with Sanders. But if one wanted to make the only viable comparison there is, it would be that Warren, in some respects, points to an imagined past. Now, I won't lean on that argument because I think that's an academic argument and it can maybe be elucidated in a certain way. But for purposes of sort of campaign tactics, we shouldn't be cheapening and smearing either campaign with that comparison. But there is a fundamental understanding in the Sanders campaign that, yes, has the game been rigged in different ways? Has there been times where obviously America was far better for workers in the middle class? Without a doubt. And that's why in some ways, as radical as Sanders' campaign is, as we always say, I mean, from Harvey K to Adolph Reed, there is a major part of Sanders' campaign, which is just simply that the New Deal and the Great Society were great in many ways. They were building a really good social democracy. They were stopped because of racism and because of structural impediments, because of the racial dynamics of our society. Bernie Sanders wants to complete those programs in a fully democratized, universal way that transcends and resets the society. Warren is talking about not a time when it wasn't rigged in terms of things like the New Deal, though, and an impulse towards broader social democracy. She still talks about being an ardent capitalist and has a commitment to the mythology of a game and a system that has never worked for a broad set of working people. And to the extent it did work, it was because of labor gains and redistributive policies, not because of an ethical capitalism. And one needs to take that in and absorb that, even if one does not want to fundamentally change the market system, because that is an objective historical reality. How you reach your conclusions matters. Highlighting the difference between Bernie and Warren isn't about nitpicking or attacking. It's about making a distinction about two very different societies: a well-regulated capitalism or a democratic, socialistic future. I might add a well-regulated, technocratic capitalism, because if you still are playing in that game, you are still going to run the risk of creating additional bureaucracies in people's lives that they don't like. And bureaucracy is totally distinct from size and scale of government. You deal with something like the NHS, you're dealing with little to no bureaucracy. You're dealing with a big, excellent institution that gets you healthcare. And to the extent there's problems with it not getting you healthcare, it's because of New Labor and Tory privatization and cuts, period. That's it, full stop. The difference between Warren and Bernie Sanders' plans are important because while they both address the failures of U.S. capitalism, Bernie's plans are set on taking us for the next fight and our transition to a truly better and more sustainable world. And yeah, please jump in.
Yeah, I mean, and I think hitting on that point is so important. The last point about Bernie Sanders' politics and that how they're laying the groundwork for the next fight, which is the idea that it's not just about mitigating some, symptoms that we're seeing now, but actually pushing them even forward to saying like, all right, things are bad now, but we actually have a vision for a much better future that's going to function better than any kind of imagined past that's ever existed. And that's where you really start to, are able to mobilize people in a much broader way than I feel like the Warren campaign's been able to.
Definitely. Well, and I think, yes, that fundamental distinction of not me, us versus she has the plan still also speaks even. And again, I want to say our viewpoint is socialist, but I think even in that broader democratic impulse, that the training of the technocracy to off-source those decisions so that she has a plan, they have a plan, so-and-so is so smart, versus we actually have to do this. And then that actually points to a structural contradiction in the Warren campaign, right? Because they've caught up with the Sanders argument. And now anybody, I mean, Jon Favreau acknowledged recently with Brie that whether or not you elect a Sanders or some centrist whatever, that you need to have a movement behind you to do anything. So she has a plan, but also I have a movement is a fundamental contradiction. Like, that's not a dialectic. That's a contradictory impulse of what we're actually doing here.
And if we've learned anything over the past years, especially with, the many failures of the Obama administration when they had power, right? When they were in control of, all branches of government, the inability to be able to put forward a love program was certainly one of, their personal ideology itself. Definitely. But also, we have to have learned this lesson that to be able to make any change, you need to have a massive groundswell of people to do it. You can't just put people in elected positions and then expect things to change. And that's another reason why the fact that there's a political movement that's outside of the electoral game itself with Bernie Sanders is so important. That it's really mobilizing people in their communities to be involved, that there'll continue to be a political force even outside of election time.
Definitely.
Yeah, and I know we don't want to harp on this comparison, but it reminds me of Tia Ria Francos when she said this when Tucker was, peacocking about supporting Elizabeth Warren a few months ago.
Right.
But she says, Warren's call for economic patriotism resonates with the xenophobic right. That's because it assumes a mythic unity between American bosses and workers aligned against foreign competition. But workers and bosses' interests cross borders. And it kind of reminds me of, 5 years ago, this was much less certain, but the term progressive was sort of the main banner, right? And the problem I have with that is if you historicize that for America, it's like you go to Teddy Roosevelt, and you go to sort of like a sort of nationalistic corporatism, but that was like fixated on fairness and like did a lot of good antitrust stuff, but was still like focused on national leadership and pride.
Well, that's her message.
Yeah, exactly.
That's undeniable. I mean, again,
but she's a true progressive in that sense.
She is, and that goes back to that goes back to the green militarism stuff. I mean, that is and I want to be clear. I think Harvey K really does navigate a course. I absolutely think that Bernie is a patriot and absolutely loves America because America, I mean, there's so many different traditions of what that even means, but I think he is of that worker-oriented, broad-based vision. And I do think that, yes, there is a continuity there of we can have a powerful national capitalism, and the advantage is you break up monopolies, you do these really important interventions, but it does not have a fundamental power rebalancing, and it also is again, it makes a lot of sense that just the total limitations and even real embrace of militarism. And, I keep harping on this because, frankly, like, the ecological dimension of these things demands that everybody pay attention. And I would say, look, I'm not a big, I'm not a big, I don't go to moral arguments that often, frankly, although obviously they're always there. But I don't understand how you can fancy yourself some type of sort of like, conscious voter and not think that, wow, my vote affects literally every single human being on the planet. And you need somebody who's constructing something different in foreign policy. And the only person who's putting it on the table remotely happens to be the leading left candidate. So, I don't know. Plenty of time to make this argument, but I really hope that can, come across. Let's do the shout out after. I'll do a brief pitch because we're running late for Elaine. Maybe even a more full one later. I just want to say, guys, come see us in Chicago. That's in a couple of weeks. We're excited. Chuck Meritz and Gene Bajlan are going to be there. Get your tickets at Lincoln Hall for our August 24th show. Get a VIP ticket. Come hang out with us beforehand. We're excited. We're excited to hit the Midwest. Excited to hit the heartlands. I've never I spent the weekend in Chicago once, but I was basically working. So
I've
looking
been to
forward see the
Chicago
place.
about 4 times, and I loved it. 2 of them were in January, and the other 2 were in the summer. I liked all of them.
Wow.
My brother lives there. I love hanging out in Chicago. I'm excited.
Awesome. So we're excited. Guys, at this point, this is actually a pretty conservative goal, but we'd like to get over 2,600 this month. We're certainly well on our way to doing that. Sometime in the fall, we want to cross 3,000. New documentary being released in a couple of days for 21 and above patrons that Vic and I just finished up doing. It's a full history of Brazil. I mean, it covers the things that we've talked about a lot about in the show, but actually goes back to the 60s. It has an origin history of U.S. involvement, the workers' movement, the student movement. There's also the Skype calls or the group calls we do for 21 and above patrons. If you're able to do that, I would really do that because it's a whole other layer of engagement and it really helps us sustain. And you can see we have in different ways. We already from what we've done, we have been able to expand in terms of like significantly upgraded the YouTube content. We've started doing the documentaries. We've the additional great reading lists that David puts together just allows us to really make it a strong, broad-based effort, and of course to have resources going to everybody for what they put in. So join today. It's definitely time to do it if you haven't yet. We welcome you. Patreon.com/TMBS. Patreon.com/TMBS. We'll take a brief break. We'll be right back with Elaine Yu of the AFP. She's going to be joining us from Hong Kong. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show. Joining us now on the line from Hong Kong is Elaine Yu. She's a reporter for the AFP based in Hong Kong. Elaine, thanks so much for being here. How are you?
I'm good. Thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure. So we're gonna, we'll do some context setting. Actually, I will say for TMBS patrons this past Sunday, I had a very good conversation with Elaine where she helped do some real history and context setting for what's happening. But there's a lot of activity right now. So can you just tell us maybe what's happening at the airports from a movement perspective in terms of the uprising in Hong Kong? And what are the latest signals that the Chinese government is sending with regards to the protests?
Right. So chaos gripped Hong Kong's airport yesterday, on Tuesday, as pro-democracy protesters staged a very disruptive sit-in that paralyzed hundreds of flights, and police eventually had to fire pepper spray in the airport. And 2 men thought to be undercover cops for Chinese were also surrounded, and one was beaten as well. So the last day definitely sees the stakes being raised for the protests, and Beijing is also sending increasingly ominous signals that the unrest must end. And state-run media even showed videos of security forces gathering across the border. So you can really feel, the stakes are rising now.
And what those security forces are People's Liberation Army forces specifically?
They, looked like military forces, but of course, state-run media has their propaganda and their message that they want to show, and they have adopted a very hardline rhetoric. But of course, it's a part of their propaganda. But now people are seeing tensions are running so high, and we are seeing unprecedented levels of chaos and some ugly scenes at the airport as well. So the last 2 days really at the airport has become a sort of turning point for the movement, and we're for the first time seeing real signs of splinter in the movement as well.
Are they still occupying the airport, and could you tell us what those splinters are, and then maybe more broadly, can you start explaining the different factions inside the sort of broader kind of like Hong Kong movement generally? Like, what are the forces that are aligned with labor and the left? What are the forces that are maybe more nationalist? That type of thing?
Right. I think the splinters right now, or the signs of divisions we're seeing, is very much focused on tactic and how to keep the movement going and how to escalate it. So to understand yesterday's scenes at the airport where two men thought to be undercovers were effectively detained and zip-tied. So to understand those scenes, there are two important developments that have happened. The first is that police have recently disguised themselves as activists to make arrests, and that has sent paranoia soaring among protesters. So they have dressed themselves in the signature black T-shirts, and they wore the gas masks with the pink filters that protesters have been wearing, and they started making arrests. So their sense of paranoia is really pronounced among protesters right now. And secondly, the second context is that a woman was severely injured in the eye. She was reportedly shot by police in the face by a beanbag round, and her eye was reportedly ruptured, and people were saying she could lose her vision. And that's why starting on Monday, you're seeing the airport completely occupied, and you're seeing the phrase "an eye for an eye" graffitied and scrawled all over the airport. And there are just imagery of, this bleeding eye everywhere. And it's really the center of anger for protesters. And police brutality has always been a theme at the protests, but yesterday, in the last 2 days, you really see it, shaping the movement in unprecedented ways. So emotions are running extremely high, and which led to yesterday or Tuesday in Hong Kong time, where two men were surrounded and tied at the airport. And one was turned out to be a journalist for the Chinese state-owned media Global Times. The editor-in-chief of the Global Times confirmed that one of the men were their reporters. And so what happened was that protesters said this man was taking close-up shots of them, and they were worried that he was a spy. So they surrounded him. He was tied, by plastic straps, and you could see, some cuts and bruises on him as well. And there was this sort of mob that surrounded him, and paramedics had to really fight their way in and, rescue this person and send him onto the ambulance. So, these ugly confrontations are unprecedented as of yet, and the divisions are pertaining to, a lot of people online on a very popular forum where people have been discussing tactics are saying, it looks like we really made a mistake yesterday. We have to, set ground rules for this movement, and how come, what led to yesterday. We really have to have some internal feedback or ways to self-correct, essentially.
And so Yeah, and because that's interesting, because one of the other things that's been striking me about the protests is the incredible ingenuity of like occupying different areas, then kind of like moving out, going somewhere else when the authorities come. I've also read that that even things that you might not think about but are really important logistically, like having prepaid Metro cards that are handed out to people so that there's speed of movement, but there's also I just want to acknowledge we're playing some of this footage. It's very disturbing for people who are watching it as I talk over it. That there's the Metro cards, and that also when they're prepaid, that makes it you can't track people's purchases in the same way, and obviously that makes it more difficult for the authorities to surveil. Can you bring us back now to the different phases of what this movement is actually demanding? And maybe now it's changing significantly as things continue to accelerate. But in order to do that, could you at least take us back? I know I'm asking a lot, but to 1997 and the origins of one country, two systems, and how that fits into how things are playing out now.
Yeah, everything is absolutely connected in that way from, way back to 1997. So Hong Kong was handed back from British rule to Chinese rule in 1997 under the promise that Hong Kong would be guided by this principle of one country, two systems, and would be able to retain a very high degree of autonomy. It would have freedoms of speech and assembly, which doesn't exist on the mainland. It would have an independent judiciary, and it would mean Hong Kong would have law, which is very much cherished and the bedrock of success for Hong Kong. And so Hong Kong was promised that. And it was also promised to have universal suffrage, which is that everyone, ordinary people, can vote for their leaders. And that was a promise enshrined in the mini constitution called the Basic Law of Hong Kong. So there are all these, democratic promises that were never realized. So fast forward to 2014, when Hong Kong saw the unprecedented civil disobedience mass movement called the Umbrella Movement, where people occupied major roads in different parts of Hong Kong for 79 days. That was something that no one saw happening, but that was completely spontaneous and sort of grassroots and organized, just, bottom up by the people. And they were calling for the right to elect their own leader, which is selected by a very small group of people and eventually appointed by Beijing. They're saying, the Constitution promised this right to us, let's have it. And that failed. And since then, we have seen a crackdown on dissent and on opposition by the government, both Beijing and the local Hong Kong government. And, in the past 5 years since the Umbrella Movement in 2014, we have seen freedoms being eroded step by step. And we see the courts being politicized to go after effectively dissidents and active pro-democracy activists. So, and the latest movement was sparked originally by this bill, right? This reviled bill that would have allowed extradition to mainland, which would mean exposing people in Hong Kong familiar and used to rule of law to China's judicial system, which is, a cause for major alarm for all sectors, from business to legal to workers. It's just a large cross-section of society who could be caught up in this. So it started with this bill, but, we're in the 10 weeks of this protest movement now, and since then it has morphed into a call for democracy again. And with police for the first time using just so much tear gas, and for the first time rubber bullets and sponge rounds and beanbag rounds and all these new weapons, and which they say are used to disperse largely peaceful protesters, but also some more confrontational and violent protesters as well. A new rallying call has been for, against police brutality and for an independent investigations into these allegations of police violence. And many people think this is a very basic thing to do, that it should not be hard for Hong Kong to set up an independent investigation into police behavior, but authorities have completely refused to compromise on that point. So we're seeing a deadlock now, with protests escalating in terms of their level of force and intensity, and police violence also escalating. So it's really, even Carrie Lam, the pro-Beijing leader, who is, the focus of ire
She's
all
the
these
head
weeks
of
and all
Hong
these
Kong,
months.
right? Just to tell people,
Yes.
Carrie Lam. Yep.
Yeah, she's the head of Hong Kong, and she is, now definitely the most unpopular leader in Hong Kong's history since the handover. And she has just refused to compromise on all these protesters' demands. She did agree to suspend the bill, but protesters are calling for a permanent withdrawal. And people are questioning why she can't just say the word withdraw. She said the word suspend, she said the word dead, but people were still distrustful, because they basically see no way they can trust the government that this bill will be permanently gone until they use the word withdraw. So there's a complete breakdown of trust, between two sides, and the government has only adopted a completely hardline approach, which is, of course, only going to make things worse.
So it would be in waves, right? Because there was some police response. Then there was the day or two where they unleashed, they contracted triads gangs to beat protesters. Now there's just been a real acceleration of police response, and then the next step would be actual direct Chinese intervention.
There's definitely talk about Chinese intervention. Analysts are saying, the calculus for China for Beijing to send in, to intervene in their own ways, whether that's military or not, they have to make a very, very delicate calculus. And it was quite unthinkable in the past few weeks. But people are saying, when the Chinese Communist Party is under threat, a lot of things are possible. So, the thing about Hong Kong's movement is that you can't really predict what's going to happen anymore. But for the Chinese military to get involved, that would, of course, evoke the bloody crushing of pro-democracy protests in China in 1989 in the Tiananmen Square massacre. And, of course, that remains one of the darkest chapters of modern Chinese history. And, of course, Beijing authorities are aware of that. But now the stakes, have just changed, and I still think it will have to take quite a lot for that to happen. But there are analysts I've seen saying maybe nothing can be ruled out at this point.
Well, it also strikes me, and I hate to be pessimistic, but it's this is also the era where we have, and I don't idolize what came before this. I think obviously, there's plenty of structural problems in, say, the 1990s order of the world. But if we're in a geopolitics where India can just say, and there already were enormous human rights problems in Kashmir, but an Indian government can just say, no, we're tearing up the Constitution, we're just going to do it. I mean, there is this sort of broader global atmosphere from the United States to India to Brazil and so on. And I'm not saying that China follows those leads, but there's clearly a pattern here which that would fit in terms of just this sort of authoritarian acceleration. Yeah, sorry. Go. I had one more question, but go ahead, please. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I was just going to add.
Yeah,
in terms of global geopolitics, with the rise of authoritarianism and all the events, unraveling, it could fit into, the broader and extremely alarming trend we're seeing globally. So yeah, just to say, you're right to point that out in a global context.
Do you think that this? So I understand that since the handover in 1997, that the Chinese government has not honored the agreement in totality, obviously, but we do have a new well, not at this point, he's not a new Chinese leader, but a Chinese leader now who is definitely has taken things in a bit of a different direction in terms of sort of like Chinese external posture. So what role does a more sort of like, and it's still relative, I mean, I do think it's important in an American audience that, like, yes, China's certainly gotten more assertive in foreign policy, and there's areas that have always been points of contention, whether it's the occupation of Tibet, situation with Hong Kong, situation with Taiwan. And then besides that, I mean, obviously the United States is infinitely more of an interferer across the world. However, we see this sort of new rhetoric, a new approach in some ways, a different stance in Africa, kind of a new great game in Africa. So to what extent do you think that there's also just the specific dynamics of Xi Jinping and what's happening in a Chinese context right now?
Yeah, so President Xi is the most powerful leader since Mao and in decades, and he has really concentrated power around him. When he basically declared himself president for life by abolishing the term limits for presidents, people are saying in Hong Kong, how can you have two systems, one under one emperor? So basically, that moment has really dashed any hopes of democracy in Hong Kong, but people are still fighting for it. And since you mentioned Tibet and Taiwan as well, of course in Xinjiang, where more than 1 million Muslims have been detained, in these concentration camps.
The Uyghurs. Excuse me.
Exactly. Yeah, and Hong Kongers are looking to that as well. And they're saying that is the dystopian version of this Chinese government. And if Hong Kongers don't fight for it, one day they can become like that as well, subject to extreme surveillance and just completely deprived of the most fundamental human rights. So we're seeing, these happening in the border regions of China, and most notably and most horrifyingly in Xinjiang. So definitely, in the era of Xi Jinping, you sense that, heightened level of authoritarianism, and it really shapes the urgency of this current movement as a result.
Elaine, I really appreciate your time. I hope you'll keep us posted, and I know it's extremely late, maybe extremely early in Hong Kong, but please keep us posted. We'll continue to follow this. I really appreciate your time.
No, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you. Elaine Yu, she's a reporter for the AFP. I just want to say we'll probably do, because I have to get to Bree very briefly, so we'll do the segments probably after Bree. But I just want to say, look, I've seen some people, if you say that something like what's happening in Hong Kong, I'll just put it this way. If your only interpretation of the world is that the only actor in the world is the CIA and U.S. imperialism, you're just not in the world. There's other actors, there's other interests, there's other competing tendencies. Now, I have no problem saying, and it's still the case, that the United States is still the most powerful. I mean, we are an empire in decay, but we're still an empire. And we have a incredible dominance across the globe. But I would say, I mean, look at this paradox a little bit. I have no doubt that there might be U.S. policymakers that are quite eager to see China have an embarrassment, to cause instability. there might absolutely be some money floating around from National Endowment for Democracy or maybe even different intelligence agencies to seed this or that movement. But there's one hand is these are just movements. There's no interaction with international politics. That's impossible. Hong Kong's strategically important. It's it's run by the second largest superpower in the world. There's always a U.S.-China relationship. Then there's everything that happens on the planet is engineered by the CIA. Sorry, that's not how the world works either. Some things are, but not every single thing. And then there's I think very much the reality of this situation, which is that it's absolutely organic. People are absolutely terrified. Their rights and concerns are absolutely real. Elaine is a great reporter and she's covering the whole terrain. I think for purposes of this show, we're going to be particularly concerned, obviously, about the labor sector as an example. And Hong Kong, for all of its immense inequality, was, as an example, a headquarters where independent labor union monitors could at least get some transparent information on, as an example, Apple's sweatshop labor, in partnership with local Chinese companies, right? That would be totally eliminated by the repression and crackdown that has already been being in the process of happening in China. And then, and also just be real regionally. I mean, this is China's sphere of influence in their own sort of sense of empire and influence. And again, this is where I flip, right? Like if China and Russia can play a marginal role to stop, to fight the just disgusting U.S. blockade on Venezuela and the endless attempts at regime change, particularly in Venezuela, but also actually, there's clearly Cuba and Nicaragua strategies is there as well. And we also know even about the U.S. role in Brazil. Never discount the regional hegemonic influence. And frankly, that goes for Russia in less of a scale than China, but it goes for Russia too. So, could there be involvement from our agencies to enhance an instability and a conflict? Yes. Are the conditions behind that conflict and uprising real, legitimate, and organic? Yes. And is the Chinese system, even as it is the Chinese government, certainly is not, just definitionally does not have the weight in the world that the United States has. But if you think that China, look, if you're arguing for multipolarity, which is that even if other systems are, extractive and corrupt and repressive and so on, but you want blocks in certain areas, sometimes that argument works. If Russia and China help stop the invasion of or regime change in Venezuela, that's great. That's just pure power counteracting. But in the bigger picture, if you actually want to generate a world that maybe is actually a post-empire world, not in some utopic sense, but really we've actually managed to find a different way of doing international relations, and we've really actually moved to some post-capitalist modes of production and so on, then you're obviously not going to be embracing the Chinese model of globalizing international relations either. And it would just be, pure naivete and apologetics to try to justify Chinese foreign policy or that system. And I think that what is happening in Hong Kong could get extremely awful. And being honest and intellectually coherent about it does not subtract for a second from calling out, and I forget calling out, attempting by whatever means that we have at our disposal in our society to attempt to democratically dismantle our empire. There's zero contradiction. And that is also, frankly, the ethos of this show, right? I mean, it matters to the extent it's possible to develop these truly internationalist outlook and bonds. A major part of this uprising is labor, and also more broadly, even as we critique liberalism and so on, I think that particularly if, for those of us hanging out in places like Brooklyn, let's not be naive about how much we like a certain set of those ranges of protections, and we'll want them in any system. So that's my sort of post-game spiel on that for people who are going to hit me up with, I can't believe you didn't ask.
CIA propaganda hour.
Well, you trade some. They traded me free Lula for CIA Hong Kong.
People need to understand that global intelligence isn't quite so centralized, although
It
Langley is a
is.
good hub.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's, I mean, and just that, you know, there aren't, as again, I think it's so important to make that the you know, someone like Noam Chomsky would never for a second say that America was like some type of special, unique empire from like a moral perspective, right? Like he would say it fits in a pattern of empires, and empires are bad. And yes, you could pay particular focus on the United States if either, you know, A, you're a U.S. citizen, or B, you just want to say we need to focus on the most powerful and destructive one. Absolutely. But that does not correlate with denying that other countries and other systems have their own extreme inequities and problems. And frankly, I mean, look, you could just as easily throw this at liberals. I mean, I remember liberals for a very long time. Oh man, you know, the Europeans are where we need to go. And I don't deny the accomplishments of European countries domestically, but are you kidding me? Where we want to go? You look what the French do in Africa. Are you kidding me? It's disgusting. I mean, oh, Canada, they're really nice. Look at what Canada does to the Caribbean. Look at what Canada does to their own First Nations people. I mean, come on. Let's be real here. All right, we need to take a brief break, and we're going to come back with TMBS crew emeritus, and I believe she's it's some type of nonprofit that helps retired rabbis vacation in the Caribbean.
Something to do with the Dodgers or something.
Something to do with the Dodgers. All right, Briahna Joy Gray will be with us in a few minutes.
Good morning, Rebel.
Yes, indeed, boo. Yes, indeed, hiss.
Perhaps I could have poked or prodded in another way, but I felt trying to figure out why he thinks as he does is what my job is.
Hello.
Welcome back to the majority. Whoa, you can really tell I'm jet lagged. I would never make that mistake. Welcome back to the Michael Brooks Show.
I didn't even notice.
Joining us now is TMBS. I was gonna say emeritus, but I think she's always TMBS crew, and she is now. My understanding is, Bri, you're doing something. You're involved with a foundation that is involved with Jewish senior citizens.
Michael Jamal Brooks, you are going to be determined to get me into trouble in this episode. I can already tell. But
No,
I am
I'm
here
totally
in my
done.
official capacity as the National Press Secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I can have none of your tomfoolery.
All right, we are so. I'm going to give you a shofar. Okay. Briahna Joy Gray, our friend, TMBS crew, is the brilliant, ever resourceful National Press Secretary for Bernie Sanders, the campaign, the movement, and the man that we absolutely must elect president. Shofar, Bri. And look, if there wasn't a little tomfoolery, it just wouldn't be right. But now we'll pivot off of it. Don't worry. Could you imagine? I mean, look, if you went to work for another campaign, I would give you a very hard time.
I mean, as well you should. Since you've known me from the early days, I mean, people might not realize that I think the Michael Brooks Show was the first media I ever did after writing for the first time. This is before I joined The Intercept, when I was still just an anonymous lawyer in the summer of 2017. I started freelancing because I was just so frustrated with the media narratives that were out there. It was you who had me on first to talk about my article about identity politics and current affairs, and then my subsequent article about cultural appropriation.
Yes, and actually,
you put me on the map.
I quote your article in the concluding chapter of my forthcoming book, by the way.
Do you really? Which one?
The cultural appropriation one, because it relates. The distinctions you made in that piece correlate really nicely with some of the points that Cornel West made on Joe Rogan and the argument I'm making about socialist cosmopolitanism. So all the tributaries.
That Joe Rogan interview. Yeah, that interview was so great that I ended up clipping some of Cornel West for the most recent episode of our podcast, the campaign podcast, Hear the Burn, which I produced. And the episode that came out this morning with Dr. Kianga Yamada Taylor is all about solidarity building, and uses a lot of those clips because, I mean, you don't even have to listen to it to imagine what it means for someone like Joe Rogan to be interviewing someone like Cornel West and for them to be having such simpatico. I mean, that's the kind of work. That's the kind of like gains to trade, accessing those kinds of gains to trade is the kind of work that, you know, a successful political campaign needs to be able to do. And having him as one of our surrogates, you know, it really helps me know that we're on the right track.
100%. I want to start by asking you, I want to get into this sort of primary juxtaposition, which is really intensifying now between like what Bernie Sanders and the campaign are actually doing and the just kind of, I mean, just this relentless media barrage against them. We talked about this with Crystal Ball a little bit a couple weeks ago, and we gave our thoughts as, you know, sympathetic outside analysts, in my case of, you know, a full endorser and so on. But before we get to that, I thought it was very revealing. You had on Jon Favreau on Hear the Burn recently. And Jon Favreau, of course, is, you know, Crooked Media, campaign speechwriter for Barack Obama, for President Obama. And I thought it was fascinating because at one point in the interview, and it was a, you know, it was a very nice, I would actually recommend, I think actually particularly for people on the left who would like to hear somebody who undoubtedly, I, you know, speaking for myself, have plenty of disagreements with, but who is certainly, you know, he's trying to work this. He's a good faith actor is the phrase I'm looking for, and certainly in that conversation, he agreed at one point in the conversation with the central thrust of the Sanders campaign, at least as I heard it. Can you talk about that and how significant? I think that was really significant.
Yeah, I think the moment you're referring to is he gave credit, Bernie Sanders a lot of credit for being the only campaign that is really treating organizing and the mass movement approach as a key part of its political strategy and identify that as a political strategy that is required to win in this moment, which is a significant moment given that, you know, Jon Favreau represents to many on the left a much more you know, centrist. And we talked about this at the beginning of the episode, right? Like how all of these words, descriptors for all of our respective groups can be kind of weighted and you know, people are offended by them. But I'm hesitant to say centrist because I don't want to treat him as a bad faith operator. But, you know, someone who represents a more centrist lane, you know, it was surprising to me how much we didn't directly go head to head on some of those big principal ideas. But where we did have some disagreement and what kind of emerged as a theme of the episode is this idea that the left tends to understand political conflict and people who, you know, don't operate in the best interests of the people, let's say political bad guys, as less bad guys because they have bad personalities or they just are kind of like sitting like cartoon witches in a castle rubbing their hands together, wishing ill on the American people, but because, you know, we think of it in terms of systems of power. So there could be a perfectly well-meaning politician who feels that in order to get reelected in their district has to be beholden to the biggest donors in their interest, in their district rather, who might be from the pharmaceutical companies, might be from the gun industry, a number of industries that have interests that are opposed to the majority of Americans. Whereas people on the left, you know, in the center, whatever you want to call it, you know, moderate Democrats tend to characterize good actors and bad actors in terms of just like kind of personal will. Right. And so there was this moment when we were talking about healthcare and the debate, the last round of debates had just happened, or at least the first night of them had happened. And we were talking about the healthcare policies. And Jon Favreau implied that there wasn't that much daylight between Kamala Harris's policy and Bernie Sanders' policy.
That was a moment where I didn't feel as charitable. I'll just say that.
I mean, look, the purpose of this episode was to bridge the divide, right? So we talked through it. I didn't intend to get on that subject for 20 minutes of a podcast, but it ended up happening.
You had to.
And what kind of came out of that, and what I think ended up being a theme. And there's a version of this episode that you could watch on YouTube, right, straight to the interview. There's another version that the podcast, and in the podcast I editorialize a little bit at certain points. at the end, I basically said what the theme of this, I think, that emerged was this kind of lack of cynicism from the center about what is really motivating candidates. So at one point, John Pepper says about Kamala Harris's plan, well, why do you think she could have or would have supported Bernie Sanders' Medicare for All plan in 2017 or whatever it was, and then change her mind now if she were bought by interest? You know, it doesn't make sense to me that she would say one thing and say another thing if she didn't really believe it. And to me, and I don't mean to target Kamala Harris in particular, but to me, conceptually, the idea of believing something at one point when you're not in the middle of a campaign season and then saying something different at a different point when you are solicitous of donations or you are being, having conversations with members of the Democratic establishment about who should be the establishment bearer, the standard bearer candidate for the party. It's entirely consistent to have a different point of view when the stakes are higher. And he seemed to see that as me kind of like, trying to knock Harris in particular, as opposed to making a structural commentary on just how politics works.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was incredibly revealing, because I actually think in a way that attitude actually is a bridge into understanding, I think, also some of the incredible media hostility that Bernie Sanders gets, because there are the obvious and structural runs which you guys are hitting, and I'd like you to talk about a little bit, and some of it is material, right? Like, you don't need to it doesn't need to be conscious or spelled out, but I mean, of course, there's a reason. He said yes, like, of course there's a correlation between Jake Tapper and Anderson Cooper always, and others, those are just the names that come to mind, always asking incredibly weighted questions in favor of, Republican industry talking points about healthcare. Is that, look, if the CNN lineup was primarily advertised by, the UAW and the Teamsters, the guiding lines of the questions would obviously be different. Again, you'd have to be pretty, in my opinion, you'd have to be extremely naive to not understand that. But I think that actually is the social part of the problem, which is, I think that there's a material thing that is being run up against, but then there's actually also that there's a lot of folks in media who don't even necessarily see that part, the material part of it, and they actually are kind of socially offended by pointing out the obvious. So you have this weird relationship where you guys are saying something that's actually like pretty obvious to a vast majority of normal people, but the filter bubbles that it goes through are populated by like the tiny part of the population that is so immersed in it that they don't get it. And I think that's maybe why they're so triggered.
Yeah, I've never read Manufacturing Consent, but I found myself wanting to know more for no particular reason.
You're gonna need to read that for this campaign, Bri.
So I was someone had put together like a little YouTube. There was a movie made, and someone put together like a summary of it. So I was watching that actually earlier today, and what I was struck by was, the media has chosen to characterize Bernie's kind of like, off the cuff, kind of humorous remarks about Washington Post and Jeff Bezos as this literal, like, oh, there's an edict from Jeff Bezos, a memo goes out, and all, he's canceling op-eds and dictating the editorial room, by picking up the phone or what have you.
Right.
When the argument is so much more subtle, and it has to do with things like the fact that the people who are pundits in journalism and creating the content for these shows are members of an elite class. And I say that as someone who was a journalist and a member, some absurd percentage of journalists went to Ivy League schools. Right. Probably in part because to become a journalist, you have to have such an incredible amount of financial outlay at your disposal to take the kind of gigs that you have to take to work yourself up, Manufacturing Consent, they talk about the fact that if you have a media institution that's driven by ad sales, and advertisers are constantly pushing to sell higher value products, then what's happening is that you're constantly courting a wealthier market that is obviously going to have different interests and needs than the average everyday the worker, and then the message, you're going to attract them with messaging and stories that is attractive to that audience, which means that the interest needs the stories that appeal to and concern everyday working people do not get the same airtime. So when Bernie Sanders says, we don't talk about poverty, no one asks me about poverty, it's not because we're making some accusations. Gets back to the John Favreau point. It's not because we're making some accusation that, Anderson Cooper personally doesn't care about poverty. I'm not making a claim about his morals or ethics as an individual. I'm sure he cares a great deal. But it does say something that, we live in a society that puts us in positions where, we have a person who's famous for being the son of a famous billionaire as one of our, Gloria Vanderbilt's child, as one of our, as a figurehead on a major news network. And that's, I don't want to single him out as a one example. And again, it's not about him personally, but it's about what kind of structures exist where a certain kind of person is talking about the news, certain kinds of interests are represented, and how do you get to a place where there's such an extraordinary disconnect between what's happening in the media and what's happening on the ground that, surprise, surprise, things like Donald Trump happen. And why have we not learned from the lesson of 2016?
And it's a very interesting, I've had my criticisms of Joe Rogan, sometimes pretty sharp. There's other things I really like about Joe Rogan. And then there's just, there's other, just the other part that content, some of the stuff, it's just people are interested in different things and not interested in others. And people need to, I think, sort of, ease up a bit on some of the aspects of sort of worrying about every single aspect of content all the time. But what I did find striking is that, Joe Rogan was so much more able in a weird, I don't think he would characterize himself this way. I don't know how he would, but I actually think in a way, he's actually much more representative of what somebody who might self-identify as being in some type of political center would actually look like in 2019, which is like heterodox, very all over the place, and again, the truth of the matter was that he gave Bernie Sanders an incredibly fair hearing. He pushed him in some ways that I know people on my side didn't like, but frankly, I've heard those questions. Not every person who's ever asked me the socialism questions or whatever are arch reactionaries who don't get it.
Right.
There are plenty of normal people who are super stoked and receptive about creating a humane, good society. And they have some concerns, some of which maybe are based off of some misinformation, or others of which are based off of there's human history, and some systems that have called themselves those names have been pretty bad to people. And but I think that was so revealing that it's the sort of at least some form of independent quote unquote centrism at least has the space to not be so innately offended by all of these taboos that seem obvious for the rest of us.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I will admit to being somewhat naive about this until kind of an embarrassingly adult age. But I know there was this moment where I was, again, freelancing, still just being a lawyer, and I was reached out to by someone who writes for The Atlantic. And they said, well, we might be doing something where you might be able to write for us and come on board. And I was very excited about it because, again, I was trying to escape my law firm.
I remember.
Then he caveated it. You remember that. You were a sounding board for me. Yeah, I remember there was this moment where he said, he admitted, okay, but FYI, because at the time I had been just writing for Current Affairs. And he said, FYI, you probably won't be able to be as progressive here, or say as much here. Don't remember his phraseology, but basically you won't be able to go so far left here as you can, as you've been doing so far. And I remember thinking to myself, oh, this is The Atlantic. I never would have thought for a second that I wouldn't have been able to say anything under the sun here. And I think that's part of the issue, is that we tend to see media outlets by their branding and kind of take them at face value. And so, okay, the Atlantic is progressive, and I ignore whether its leadership has had a record as a writer in which he defended a lot of, interventionist atrocities that many people on the left contemporaneously disagreed with, right? And that
very
has been kind of
much
whitewashed.
so.
Right.
Yes.
Right. We, on our media bias episode that we did a couple of weeks ago, episode 17, we look at some Media Matter statistics about which news outlet has the most skewed panels. And surprise, is actually MSNBC,
right,
whose Sunday morning panels are skewed left only 8% of the time, to the right like some 60% of the time, whereas Fox News are more balanced, more fair and balanced than MSNBC. So we turn on MSNBC, we see a host, we see that she's sitting there on MSNBC, and we assume, okay, it's a liberal network, we're going to take the words that are coming out of her mouth and the questions and the framings that she's providing in good faith. And I think that's how we get some of this bleeding, where there were all of these questions that were asked in the debates that really could have been written by Fox News panel. There was nothing to distinguish them from what you might expect from the Fox News town hall, which, to jog everybody's memory, Bernie Sanders did. It was the most viewed town hall to date in this election cycle, and he won over the entire Fox News town hall audience despite the prevarications of the host. So this is where we are. There's been this bleeding of who represents whose interests. Then the left, kind of pandering to the right, who have been working the rest for a really long time. And some people, this might not be in their taste, the fact that Bernie Sanders was offering a media critique. But if you think about it this way, the right's working of the rest has resulted in us having an entire media establishment which benefits the right.
That's right.
And
exactly.
maybe it's time for us to push back a little bit and make sure that maybe, just a thought, maybe there should be an actual, leftist, a progressive on one of these panels interviewing folks during a debate. What if someone like a Waleed Shahid, or a Michael Jamal Brooks, we're able to ask questions? What kind of questions then would moderate Democrats be getting about how they're going to perhaps explain why 10 million people under their plan or 30 million people under their plan are going to remain uninsured?
Right.
How are they going to account for the tens of thousands of deaths that will accrue over the 10 years that they have set out, the 10 years timeline they've set out for how long it's going to take for their healthcare plan?
Why is their student loan plan a gentrification accelerator that doesn't relieve the loan crisis? Yes.
I mean,
I'd ask it in a less weighted way, but yes. Although, frankly, they didn't. They did ask it in a weighted way. John Delaney, would you like to ask Bernie Sanders why his plan is going to, turn us into 1984? Would you like a follow-up?
Right.
It's just embarrassing.
I was at the National Association of Black Journalists conference in Miami last week, and Bernie Sanders gave remarks. It was only Bernie Sanders, Cory Booker, Pete Buttigieg, and Weld there to give remarks. And Bernie Sanders, the crowd was just on his side, and it was a really great event. We're going to be clipping bits of that soon and circulating them because more people need to get eyes on it. But what really struck me is that the host, it was Dan Newkirk, who writes for The Atlantic, was one of them, and this guy, I'm blocking his name, Craig. Anyway, it's not important. An MSNBC host, all black panels in ABJ. And this guy asked Bernie Sanders about his student loan program. He says, hypothetically speaking, if someone were to have worked really hard and paid off their loans just 2 or 3 years ago, the audience starts laughing because he's obviously talking about himself. Why is it fair that their loans get canceled and mine don't, basically? Right. And the audience treated it as a joke, but he was treating it kind of seriously. And I was really struck by this question because I have never in my life, and one, because I hear it all the time, right? I had a big fight with one of my boyfriend's friends about this exact same issue a few weeks ago. But what struck me about it is you never hear a version of that question that says, hi, I'm a millennial who cannot own a home because of student debt.
Right.
Why is it fair that the government gave X, Y, or Z subsidy to a homeowner and not to me? Why is it fair that someone can own $1 million home and discharge the entirety of their interest or deduct it from their taxes, the entirety of their interest payments, but as someone who has student debt, I can only discharge up to $2,000 of my payment, and that's only if I earn less than $60,000 a year. Right. The kind of benefits that are given to families, homeowners, the kind of people who have historically been, kind of like backed as the middle class backbone of this country, this dramatically shrinking middle class backbone of this country, are never perceived of as giveaways in the same way. And it would never occur to him to see himself as a beneficiary of myriad programs, childcare programs, et cetera, that someone like myself isn't a beneficiary of. But it would never occur to me in a million years to begrudge somebody else that public schools are free or libraries are free just because I am, sadly still ordering my books online.
Get on Amazon and get manufacturing consent, Brie.
That's literally what's going to happen.
I know. I'm encouraging you. I'm skipping my time with all the idealism. Just get the book. What is the relationship? There's just two more things I want to cover with you in the last couple of minutes.
Sure.
So one is, there's this media campaign against Sanders. What is actually happening on the ground in this campaign when Bernie Sanders actually goes out and interacts with actual voters?
Well, I don't begrudge you for not knowing that, Michael, because you don't get very much of a view of what's going on. But the crowds that we're seeing are massive, just like they were in 2016. And just like in 2016, they're being ignored. And the media is going to, I think, find themselves in for another one of these oopsie days of surprise moments. Bernie Sanders was in California last week. And even though we have seen this happen again and again, I wasn't in California, but every staff member who staffed the event who came back was like, even I was surprised by the magnitude of how these things are growing. Right? Like, when I got off the train, when I went to the Hahnemann Hospital protest a few weeks ago in Philadelphia, we were there trying to prevent this closure of a hospital that serves 50% Black and brown, majority, 2/3 Medicaid recipient, low-income hospital that they're closing because a venture capitalist has purchased it to sell it for condos. I get off the train in a Bernie shirt, which I normally don't wear, more because of my sartorial preferences than anything else. And this, a black cab driver in the line, as we walk out of the place, immediately starts shouting, "Bernie, that's the guy. That's my guy." If you, the whole day, as you walk around the city in Bernie attire, you realize that the people who throw their fists up, I was sitting in a hotel lobby. I just randomly chosen what hotel lobby using their Wi-Fi until I was waiting for my train. And a young white guy who was on the janitorial staff threw up a fist at me when he saw my shirt. Like, it's really clear who it is that supports Bernie Sanders. We are leading with working class voters, non-college educated voters, Black and brown voters, something, again, that the media doesn't talk about. And that is entirely reflected in what we perceive when we move through the world. And these are also people who don't have landlines and aren't getting polled, right? No one can afford just to have a $20 a month extra charge for a landline when you're only going to use it when some disaster happens and the phones go down. These people are often not voters, not people who voted previously, right? These people are not getting captured either by the media or by the polls. And so, it can be dispiriting, and I want to anybody who's listening who feels dispirited by the media narratives or the polling, et cetera, I just really want to remind you that, anytime that I start to, get a little in the doldrums, the second I'm out on the road, even in a room full of, journalists at NABJ who you might suspect, okay, they're more of an elite crowd, they have some privilege under their belt, all right. They're young, they're Black, they're millennial, they got it.
Mm-hmm. They love Bernie. The people who have a material reason to support Bernie, as you would expect, still do. And we are not, this kind of narrative that we are sharing voters or competing with voters
for voters with Elizabeth Warren, it just doesn't pan out by the polls and the research.
Can you elaborate that a little bit? Because every time, I mean, look, I think it is important, frankly, at some point in a look, the collegiality and respectfulness between Sanders and Warren is great. And, but at some point, if it comes to that, I mean, certainly I feel comfortable talking about the just very clear distinctions that exist there. And, primarily, again, that's really a sort of media war. I don't hear either of the campaigns saying that they're, the same thing. I see that as, if anything, if I was Senator Warren or worked on her campaign, I would actually, I might see the sort of short-term benefit in all of the anti-Sanders bias, but I would be worried about the future and actually, frankly, kind of angry that some really important and interesting work is basically just, often puffed up just to sort of juxtapose against Sanders. So it's really in many ways just fundamentally a media critique. But what hit, but digging into those numbers, I think that is really important. Like his base and her base right now look very, very different. And to the extent to which those distinctions are going to matter, it matters again in terms of a media narrative that feeds a lot of false equivalencies and profound dishonesty about the Sanders record and what this campaign represents. That, as I say, it just isn't even like it's the best campaign. It's just a different kind. It really is a different thing. And it's my thing. I think it's the way to go 100%. But we're not talking about relatively better in a sort of same scale because you guys are doing something different. It's a different proposition.
Yeah, and this is a little bit what we were talking about in this week's episode. The mass movement piece that John Favreau picked up on as the distinguishing factor, for me, is why I'm sitting here on this campaign, and I would not have left the job that I love for in any other. Right. And it comes down to this. I was having an off-the-record conversation with a journalist, and they were telling me about, they said, I'm broadly a member of the Bernie Warren wing of the Democratic Party, but I think I'm leaning toward Warren. And I said, okay, may I ask why? And they basically expressed that there was a policy. This person, is has kind of a similar background as that I do, in terms of education and schooling and things like that. So they said, well, I'm really into some of these technocratic fixes. There's this, she basically has this policy about, I think it was venture capital. It was some policy that had to do with regulating, high risk elite financial transactions that he was just really geeking out over because it's something that related to his own personal scholarship and background. And I said, I really appreciate that. That is a perfectly legitimate thing to like. She, has a kind of a expertise with the regulatory sector, which nobody would deny her. And, that's a perfectly credible reason to like her. But let me ask you this. Do you think that if she runs on those kinds of things, do you think that the average American is going to pull a lever next fall based on her policy with respect to hedge funds or whatever it is?
Right.
Do you think that's going to be the motivating issue? And it's not that those things aren't enormously important, and that the Bernie Sanders campaign doesn't also have, a great deal of attention paid to regulatory matters. I mean, this is it was a backbone of the campaign back in 2016. But the question is about framing and your ability to connect with myriad Americans and identify what those shared interests are that can inspire a revolution of people who aren't just kind of charmed by what's been put on the table policy-wise, but feel an investment in fighting for them such that they will not only vote, they will get 10 of their friends to vote, and once you are in office, they will continue to persist to pressure their local representatives in order to make sure that the policies that the candidate ran on actually come to fruition. And if their local representatives don't, that they're going to vote them out of office because their lives depend on it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And again, I did identify in the opening commentary, there is, Bernie says not me, us. And that is because the constituent parts of how a Sanders administration would govern already exist now. They're being built now. That's the fact that you guys use your email list to actually intervene for states where reproductive justice is, women are under attack in a fundamental way, to warn people about the ICE raids and so on. And I have to say, I mean, and as I've seen other, frankly, not just Warren, I've seen other candidates, as with all the other issues now, they're trying to, now they're subtly and not so subtly emulating Sanders' argument with regard to a movement. And it's like, in the Warren case specifically, I just would say, please watch the tension between she has a plan and will build a movement. That's not a synthesis. That's really contradictory. And not me, us is a through line that is coherent and fits together as a campaign and as a potential government to actually deliver what we really desperately need.
I obviously agree. We are of one mind on this, Michael.
And two great minds they are, Bri. Can I just one more minute, just for people who do, because there's some people in my audience, and I will say, people who are people have all sorts of different types of time, and I get it. I'm not telling anybody anything to do, but the people I know who have had a little bit more engagement with the campaign, maybe they're making a few phone calls or whatever, they feel a lot more optimistic. And then I think that there's other people that, they're news consumers, and they're getting this like relentless drumbeat that Sanders is in trouble. And it's funny to me because look, I'm not Pollyannish. I want it to be even better, obviously. And I have I have some thoughts. Maybe we'll talk about some other time about how maybe it could or whatever. But I will say this: when I see this relentless media drumbeat against Sanders, I read it as like their version of like The Secret, like their vision boarding. Like if we just repeat it enough and say it enough and visualize it enough and ignore enough polls and put him out enough headlines, him and all of these tens of millions of people just go away. And so I actually see it as that they're totally freaked out and they're doing like, new age visualization exercises on this. What would you tell people to get them back, not to be Pollyannas, but to say like, hey, like this is a front running candidate. Like we could absolutely win this thing.
Well, for one, I mean, the polls, the morning consult poll today has this in second place and not that far behind Biden.
Right.
So there's one aspect of it, which is just like, I don't have to spin it because it's true. We have been consistently, basically in second place since Biden emerged, in first place before that. And to really think about the context of what's happening here, think about where Barack Obama was a month before Iowa in 2008, pulling 30 points behind Hillary Clinton. This is a crowded field, and things are going to start to change dramatically over the next few months as people drop out. But, I genuinely don't feel any despair at all. I joined this campaign because I feel like we're going to win. Yep. And I think that we're going to win because I am so confident about the ideology and the judgment of who is running this campaign. I mean, look, some people I think are probably thinking, I'm not going to listen to a campaign podcast because I don't want to listen to some like sycophantic drivel talking about how great Bernie Sanders is for 30 minutes. Right. And that's what a lot of these podcasts are. I mean, I listened to a bunch before I started this to see what the lay of the land was. And oh boy, like it's rough. But there's some rough stuff out there. But like, we have a radical socialist, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, on this morning's episode, talking about how the tradition of the Black Panther Party and the Combahee River Collective can, bring us lessons about solidarity. We have very frank conversations with people, including people who don't actually support Bernie Sanders, but who support a broader left movement, and talk to them about what they think that we need to be doing. We have this podcast, frankly, maybe it's because not enough people are paying attention to it, but like we we are not a podcast that you would listen to and think of as a campaign podcast. And the feedback that we've been getting back, and we just want to scroll through our iTunes reviews, which I'm really proud of, is that this is a podcast which helps me understand why I like Bernie Sanders. This is a podcast that I can share with my mother or my family or my coworkers or schoolmates who aren't already bought in and who might be turned off by an overly zealous message, but who, it teaches concepts.
Yeah.
I think before every week, why do I like Bernie Sanders? Why do I identify as a leftist?
Yep.
And then I think about broader themes, like how do I understand power to work? How do I understand movement building to work? Should we do an episode about unions? Right. Should we talk in some historical detail about what unions were able to achieve to a generation who doesn't have as much exposure to unions because they've been basically abandoned by both parties historically? And let's also talk about what happened there historically and why Bernie Sanders is so different and how he's able to be so different, because he is not captured and isn't taking the donations and isn't buying into the corporate funding game that caused the demise of unions to begin with. I'm thinking thematically so that, I don't have to lead a horse to water. I'm putting you in a position, to say to come to the conclusion on your own, okay, if these are ideals that I share, and this is an understanding of a world that makes sense to me, the natural conclusion is that Bernie Sanders is the best candidate in this election. And that sets you up not just to be a Bernie Sanders supporter, but in elections down the line to have substantive left politics develop that are of the kind of politics that we need if we're going to save the world from environmental disaster, if we're going to make sure we don't live in a country where in the richest country in the world, tens of thousands of people die every year just from a lack of health care. If we're going to do some of these big ticket items that basically we have to do because they're an existential threat.
Free Lula.
Free Lula. We did a Lula episode thanks to you, Michael Brooks. It was one of my favorite guests so far.
Honestly, him saying that, I keep emphasizing this to people. That is so significant. There's a courage in it. There's a vision in it. There's also an understanding of how the world works that you have not seen in modern politics, and most people would like as a foreign policy. So definitely listening here to Burn. That's actually really important pitch. It's absolutely not and then propaganda. Someone else in Burlington loved Bernie. Like it's like an actual. I first heard it. I mean, I knew it would be good because I have total faith in you, but I didn't. I remember I texted you. I think I was on a flight somewhere, and I finally had time to load up on the first several ones, and I was like, this is an actual. It's not just that it was good; it's an actual podcast, and it is actually a door into understanding the wider context of why this campaign is happening, and that's also. I mean, that's another incredible advantage for governing. It's a media operation. So that all of a sudden it's not just here's an initiative we're doing on unions. Exactly. Here's a history of unions. Here's why there's things unions achieved in the 1920s or 30s, 40s that are still helping you today, even as they've been so clawed back by Republicans and obviously many Democrats. So Briahna,
and people need to know that history, and thank God Cardi B is out here helping remind us how great SDR was.
I keep telling people they don't know how lucky they are to have Bernie Sanders, Cornel West, and Cardi B. They don't quite get it.
It's a cool gang.
That's they don't know how lucky they are for those three right now. Briahna Joy Gray, she is the national press secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign. TMBS crew for life. Bernie is going to win. Bri, thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael.
Pleasure. All right, folks. Let's start. Maybe we'll do the shout out last. Let's let Bri's optimism soak in for 10 seconds before David tells us something horrible about the global economy. I want to echo it though. This is a very winnable campaign. And the thing that's actually really striking to me right now is with each day passing, the more it's like the primary is the battle. And you don't want to get ahead of yourself, but I'm just so confident that if Bernie Sanders wins this primary, he's going to beat Donald Trump's ass.
Oh, Debs would have loved to be in this position.
Debs would have loved to have been this, but I wonder what would they like, these sniveling mediocrities that would have been interfering with Debs. Like, I agree, but however, shut up.
Debs gets 10 million on Rogan.
Wow.
That would be good, actually.
I wonder what what is the dialect of that time?
Oh, I can't. Can
You have to go in like read E.L. Doctor or Reg time.
Yeah, it's like you ever drank moonshine? Well, no, but I defend your right to sip it and distill it.
Sorry,
wow, fuck, that's awesome.
Opium den culture would be a big part of it.
Have you ever smoked opium and laid with a Chinaman and realized that we could be living inside someone else's dream? Well, not personally, but I don't think you or the Chinaman should be criminalized for this. Wow. Fucking A, you're a different candidate. Joe Rogan and Eugene Debs. I took the swears at the end of the episode. That should be all right?
Whatever.
Give me 2 F words. My birthday, YouTube, you son of a... David. Oh, do we have the fixed graphic yet?
Yes, yeah, it's all fixed up.
Okay, great, because that was really becoming a problem. All right, go ahead, man.
Yeah, so we got a couple quick things. We have the Uber fizzle, so bad news for the Uber Corporation. So
good news for everybody else.
Well, for
Uber headquarters.
Well, ever since their I can't do this, baby.
Travis Kalanick.
Travis Kalanick. Yeah.
So ever since their IPO, we've now had a little bit of time. Their IPO obviously was very, very disappointing. And now, the second quarter of business for Uber, they've seen their largest losses since they've existed as a corporation. Pretty striking number, $5.2 billion in losses. And people are really freaking out because obviously Uber has always lost lots of money, but its revenue is down and its growth is very, very, very slow. So people who are obviously trying to move away from the stock, but a lot of people who got their stock at the IPO, they're not able to drop their stock until the next couple of months. So we might see even larger losses for the major corporation. And of course, this is where the squeeze becomes a problem. When we're talking about Uber's losses, let's not forget the fact that Uber puts a lot of their losses on their drivers. And if Uber were any other kind of corporation, the amount of damage that's done to the vehicles that Uber drivers have to pay for instead of the corporations paying for, it would be much more significant. And when you start seeing Uber needing to squeeze profits even more, we're going to see a lot of nasty implications for workers. And we're already seeing major layoffs in the Uber Corporation. 400 people have lost their jobs in the past couple of months over major layoffs. So we're definitely seeing a corporation that is very much panicking and is much more aggravated by the fact that it has so many public investors now who are demanding even more profit. But on the other side, let's talk about good news.
Yes. Well, that was good news.
It is good news.
Yeah.
Good news.
Say, baby, put down that pipe and get my pipe up.
Good news in our fight. Good news in our fight for $15 an hour. Now that New York City has been implementing minimum wage increases for restaurant workers since 2013, we've actually been able to study the effects of minimum wage increases for workers. And surprise, surprise, increasing the minimum wage is good for pretty much everybody.
Shocking.
So a study that came out from the New School and the National Employment Law Project found that since 2013, since the minimum wage increases, which have been going up, a little bit by each year to now reach $15 an hour within the city of New York, the restaurant industry is thriving in New York City. Restaurant industry, we should also mention, has the highest number of minimum wage workers in the industry. So this is a very significant win across the board. Not only has the restaurant industry grown dramatically over the past 6 years, it's not just in Manhattan, which is obviously a lot of people, tourists and people with money are coming there. Actually, significant growth has been in Brooklyn, Queens, the Bronx, and Staten Island on top of it. So it's just good across the board. And when you compare New York City with other major U.S. cities like Houston that have not had minimum wage increases, New York City still outpaces them in growth. So the fundamental fact is that these industries have plenty of money to be able to spread that money around for workers who make up a significant amount of the American workforce now. So when we hear all these arguments, oh my God, if there's a minimum wage, we're going to have to pay, $15 for milkshakes, $10, $15 for beers. Oh, all these places are going to shut her down. You can just say, look at New York City. That's not the case. You can say, look at Seattle. And you just basically are going to put it on a huge stack of literature that says the minimum wage makes people's lives better. It makes them healthier. It improves the economy. And there's no real economic argument against it. The only thing that is being pushed forward is nonsensical, ideological drivel that is not based in any kind of study or any kind of reality.
That's exactly it. Boom. What's this, Matt? What do we have?
This is a little trip down memory lane. In 2016, Uber decided to buy Carnegie Mellon's robotics department in an announced partnership, they called it. And instead what it turned out is they were just buying that and trying to get them to make self-driving cars so they can shaft the drivers faster. And then which is what everybody knew it was. Obviously, it's not like they're trying to help everybody make robots. Anyway, then Uber announced that they're taking all that stuff to Toronto, and well, are they going to help Toronto? No. The point is that I want to make is this stuff shouldn't be allowed. A corporation shouldn't be allowed to come in and buy up a research department like that. And I don't know. I don't think antitrust probably would have worked in this case. It shouldn't have the financial resources to do that, based purely on it being a speculative bet to be a transportation monopoly.
But this is where we need to connect our political struggle with the economic struggle, because what's happened in Pittsburgh is that you've had a Democratic government which has very much invited all of these major tech corporations into the city and have given them very beneficial exemptions from rules, regulations, and taxes. And what that creates is a highly extractive fucking industry. And I'm sorry, I forgot we're not allowed to curse anymore.
Yeah, please don't demonetize the show.
Uber. All these Silicon Valley companies, please don't do this to us. But no, seriously, you have to connect those two struggles.
Right. Absolutely. All right, let's do a brief shout out and then we will go to the post game. Or you know what? We're going to save the shout out for the post game today. That's what we're going to do. So folks, and let me just check out Woke Bros. Definitely subscribe to the Black Opinions Matter feed. Waz and I do a great show called Woke Bros. You hear Waz on this show. We cover slightly different topics, fairly different topics mostly, sometimes similar topics, but with a different flavor. Produced by the great Rob Lopez, masterminded by the great Jade Hoy. And also, I need to get better at this. I'll just say I just did a sit down with Connor Habib, who's a fascinating guy. We had him on for patrons recently, Spirituality and the Left. But he's someone who has just a range. Honestly, he has an MFA. He's a porn star. He's a writer, activist, podcaster, and I was lucky enough to be on his show, and it was a very, very interesting conversation. So check out Against Everyone with Connor Habib on Patreon and iTunes. And the episode before me was with Billy Bragg. So heavy hitters. All right. And of course, I want to thank each and every one of you. I want to thank the whole team, David, Matt. I appreciate everybody immensely. And this is it's my birthday. I think this is basically 2 years we've been doing this show. And we're in this obviously talk about this more later, but there's even as we plan this stuff out, we're even planning the scenarios. What are we going to do in catastrophe? Donald Trump is reelected president. We're not going to stop. We're going to continue to fight as long as we can. And this content matters. So what does that actually look like? Okay. The consensus is we want to try to go to sleep. Joe Biden, somebody like that is elected president. What do we do? Wow, Bernie, we did it. We have this incredible generational opportunity. How can we be a part of that? We're thinking and planning, and that's always actually taking us deeper into the history, the context, and the past as well, which permeates everything we do. So We're proud. We're growing. The community is really strong and much more ahead. And obviously my book is coming too. So I just thank all of you. Become a patron if you haven't done it yet. Let people know about it. Nice little other threshold on YouTube, crossing our first 67,000 subscribers. We want to definitely get above 100,000 sometime in the fall, along with over 3,000 patrons. And then we'll really start talking about all of our numbers and goals. All right, folks, we'll see you in the postgame.